It's a word loathed by politicians and the public alike, which is perhaps why Justin Trudeau studiously avoided using it during this statement to the Commons.
The government proposes that the price on carbon pollution should start at a minimum of $10 per tonne in 2018, rising $10 each year to $50 in 2022.
This could mean the arrival of a federal carbon tax policy. Some provinces are for, and some are against. The carbon referred to in the policy is carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short. It's a significant greenhouse gas which traps heat. The average Canadian contributes about 15 tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year. That's about 3 times the world average. And it's the equivalent of driving a fuel-efficient car about 105,000 kilometers. Slapping a tax on CO2 is an attempt to cut back on those emissions. What does it mean for your wallet? At the full $50 per ton level, you'd pay about 11 cents more per liter for gas. And even if you don't have a car, greenhouse gases are still emitted through things like heating and transporting the things we buy. Sweden has had a carbon tax since 1991. They tax at a rate of $140 per ton. It may sound steep, but the government believes it has helped to cut emissions by an additional 20%. Not all experts agree that a federal tax is the solution for Canada, and details of the plan still remain hazy. Whatever the case, Trudeau will have to work extra hard to get the entire country on board.
All right, so that did a really good job at framing kind of our current policy issue, the federal carbon pricing policy that may kick in later this year, starting January 1st for provinces that don't have their own carbon pricing policy. But I guess I want to start by taking a step back and asking kind of how we got here, what is the problem we are trying to solve. And I think this picture here is quite nice at framing that issue. So this, of course, is the Canadian leadership delegation to the Paris Climate Change Agreement in late 2015. And I think the photo is quite important to start us off. There's a number of things going on in the photo that I want to highlight. And of course, in the middle, we have Prime Minister Trudeau. And at this event, Canada commits to a particular goal to lower emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. That's important, I think, because it wasn't Trudeau's target. It was a target adopted by the previous Conservative government under Stephen Harper. So we agree on both sides of the federal aisle, at least, about what the goal here is and by how much we want to lower emissions. Last June, every single member of Parliament voted in favor of this target, with only one exception, and it wasn't an Alberta MP. So all Conservative MPs in Alberta voted in favor of that target as well. And then on either side of Trudeau, we have a number of provincial leaders. We have Ontario's Premier, BC's Premier, Quebec. On the far left there, we have Alberta's Premier, Rachel Notley. So I'll start there. This event was only a week or so after Alberta announced its climate leadership plan, a key plank of which was a tax on carbon. That is today $30 per ton. But then on the far side of the table, we have Saskatchewan's Premier, Brad Wall, perhaps the most vocal opponent of carbon pricing in Canada, and yet agrees with the target itself. So broadly speaking, there's not really a left-right issue about whether or not we should tackle climate change or lower Canada's emissions. The question really is, how do we do it? I think that's kind of what we want to talk about a little bit today. Next, the goal that we committed to, the 30% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030 is actually quite an ambitious target. And I think nothing really summarizes the level of ambition better than this graph here. So what it shows is, in black, Canada's actual level of emissions, now around 740 million tons of CO2 per year. In red, this was kind of where we thought Canada's emissions would go in the coming years. In blue, this is an update to that forecast that reflects a lot of the provincial action. So Alberta's climate leadership plan is reflected in the blue line, Ontario's cap and trade system, and a number of other policy decisions have led to a reduction of where we think Canadian emissions will go. But you can see at the bottom there, the the dot of Canada's 2030 target, there's still a lot to go. And part of the federal moves is to try and close that gap. And I think Dennis and I will have some conversation around whether or not this target is actually an appropriate one, or what else we might want to think about. But it's requiring a lot of Canada and would be a big change in what our future emissions are likely to be. Before moving on, I'll mention that for Canada, it's very hard to forecast what the level of emissions will be so far out into the future because it depends on so many factors that we don't have a lot of control over, the price of oil being an important one. So what is the price of oil going to be in the coming years? What will oil and gas activity be by 2030? I didn't show it here, but Environment Canada has an estimate that looks at a low price scenario of about $40 or so per barrel, lasting until 2030 versus $110 per barrel, so high price scenario. You get about 100 million tons in terms of the difference between emissions under the low price scenario as under the high. So Canada aiming for a quantity target is a particularly difficult thing for us to do, and that will lead us, I think, in the conversation to conclude that maybe we should be targeting something other than the quantity of emissions itself. Now let me end here before I pass it over to Dennis by noting that if we want to lower emissions, there are a number of ways to do it. So both left and right, all the major political parties agree that we should lower emissions, they just disagree over the method. So here I've plotted what are some various options that governments have chosen to lower emissions. We have electric vehicle subsidies in Quebec, we have ethanol subsidies in a number of places, we have the coal phase out in Alberta, carbon capture and sequestration in Saskatchewan, the carbon tax in Alberta, and they each carry different costs. So avoiding emitting isn't free. You have to change behavior, adopt new technology, make certain decisions, and there are costs associated with those decisions. So if we go back up to the electric vehicle subsidies in Quebec, Canada's Ecofiscal Commission estimates that lowers emissions by about $400 per ton, as in we're paying $400 in real economic costs to lower emissions by 1 ton. Phasing out coal, perhaps about $70 per ton. Cycling infrastructure, $500 per ton. Saskatchewan's CCS, $120 per ton. So the costs vary dramatically across options. And that's one of the merits of pricing carbon. It basically says that a government may not know what the least cost way is to lower emissions. So it sets a price, and then private individuals and businesses will engage in those activities that lower emissions at less cost than the carbon price. One thing I'll highlight is, of course, the outlier there at the top, blocking pipelines. So this is a particularly important issue in British Columbia and Alberta now. A lot of the opposition to pipelines is based on climate concerns. Keeping it in the ground, for example, is the quote we often hear, or that climate leaders don't build pipelines. To lower emissions through blocking pipelines, that comes at a cost of about $1,500 to $2,000 per ton. So it's a very inefficient way to go about lowering emissions. So putting a price on carbon kind of avoids the government having to decide what is the least cost way forward and just letting the market figure it out. I'll also note that one of the items here highlighted in red is there the social cost of carbon. This is an estimate of what we think the monetary value of 1 ton of emissions might be. Here I just plot the median estimate from Environment Canada at about $45 per ton. This is important because it really tells us what the cost of emissions is, and therefore what the benefits of avoiding emitting is. And we shouldn't really want to engage in activities that cost more to lower emissions than the benefits we get in terms of foregone environmental damage. So that social cost of carbon number gives us kind of a ballpark way to think about whether or not activities make sense or not. So I think with that in mind, I will kind of pitch it over to Dennis to kind of talk about what Alberta has done, what the features of the climate leadership plan here has been and what the implications might be for industry.
Thank you, Trevor. Well, this is another very famous photograph. It's one that people can savor. It's when the Premier was announcing the Alberta Climate Plan. And as you can see, there's 4 relatively famous, at the time, Alberta CEOs of the 4 major Canadian-controlled major oil sands operators, some notable members of the NGO community that were all, at least for that day late in November of 2015, had all found a way to compromise around some of the fundamental tenets that were included in the Alberta Climate Plan that continued to be, to this day, quite problematic. Trevor, if we could just go to the next slide. And this is a significant slide in that it demonstrates where Alberta sits today in terms of the carbon price that is now applied to some Albertans and some Alberta industries. There's still many that are basically rebated back the impact of this carbon price, and many industries that still enjoy some other forms of relief. I would draw your attention to the numbers on the left side of this graph because they put into context how stringent the Alberta carbon price is today. And notably, California, which is sort of always seen as the kind of safe haven of rational carbon policy in the United States during the Trump era, its cap and trade system, which applies primarily to large industrial emitters, itself has only been able to generate a carbon price for those who have to actually comply with it, actually lower than what is being imposed in Alberta. And that's a very significant benchmark. Also notable is the always unctuous EU has yet to been able to generate a unctuous in respect of lecturing Canada about appropriate carbon policy, has yet to be able to generate a carbon price much higher than even $14 a ton. Those are notable numbers to have context with. Now, if there's 2 or 3 ideas I leave you with this morning, the one that I most want to emphasize is that this country's carbon policy remains, in my judgment, to be unresolved, conflicted between, are we going to die on the hill of meeting those targets, or is our policy going to be primarily determined by carbon pricing? Because if we are going to meet those targets, we're going to have carbon prices towards $200 a ton, or interventions in our economy as to how we're allowed to use energy and whether we're allowed to expand certain industries that relate to hydrocarbon production, and that production will have with it increasing carbon emissions, notwithstanding the ambitions that are laudable to reduce the carbon intensity of oil sands production. Are we going to basically be defined at meeting those targets, regardless of what it costs, or are we going to be defined by carbon pricing that is constrained by the level of carbon policy that is actually being applied by what our trading partners are doing to themselves? So let me review some of the things that I think the Alberta government got right back in 2015, of which I would say there were 3 things that they did get right. They did accept that Alberta had to have a credible carbon policy, and that carbon pricing was likely the cheapest alternative for Alberta to resort to achieve a level of credibility. And credible to who? Because it is still a major question for so many Albertans, what did we get for this carbon price? But I would say that for most entities outside of Alberta that were expecting a more credible carbon position, that was largely achieved by imposing a carbon price of this level of stringency, which is, this illustrates, it is a significant number. The plan that Alberta imposed across the province had no actual carbon reduction target. It did have an oil sands emissions cap, which is problematic, and I'll speak to that later. Aggregately for the province, it had no actual carbon reduction target per se. And it did have, in the original disclosure, some conditionality to what other entities that were relevant to the Alberta economy were going to impose on themselves on carbon pricing that would inform future adjustments of this price. So those are the things that I think the Alberta government got right. What things did they not get right? As I've said publicly, I think it was a major strategic error by not making their movement to this carbon pricing conditional on getting a breakthrough on market access, which is really what did Alberta get for this. What we should have gotten is some consideration that the controversies around market access, which ultimately now comes down to is TMX built or not, and our future pipelines that are going to move Alberta gas to BC ports for LNG, are they going to get built, or are they going to continue to be embroiled in part because of the concerns about incremental hydrocarbon production taking us away from those targets? So the Alberta government never chose to make its commitment to carbon pricing conditional on market access. I think that was a strategic mistake. Also, they failed to make this regime revenue neutral. And that's revenue neutral to the aggregate tax collection of the province, as opposed to what they did do, which is collect the money. And notwithstanding the notable amount of rebates, they do have the intention of applying much of this collection to selected winners and losers of abetting certain low-carbon technology developments, an exercise that experience would tell us is fraught with misadventure. Also, they chose to impose an acceleration of the shutdown of coal-based electric generation in this province, and they've already embarked paying out existing facilities on an accelerated basis, instead of letting this carbon price actually impact whether or not those facilities endure in the supply mix or not. So they actually made an intervention that implies a carbon price much higher than the current $30. And also, they failed to really across the board simply let the carbon price be the defining element of carbon policy for Alberta and make that condition explicit in their acceptance of the national carbon pricing framework, which is the position that the Trudeau government has, which is we've got a national carbon pricing standard, but we have more intervention to come because we are going to meet those targets. The Alberta government failed to step up and say, no, pricing is the defining element of our policy, not implausible targets. So I'll just say that as my basic summation of where we stand on Alberta carbon policy.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that point, I guess if there's one takeaway message from today, it's that rational carbon policy involves setting a price and treating that as your target rather than quantity. But even after you decide that a price is what we should target, there are a number of options that you have in order to price carbon. So I'll stick on this slide here because different provinces have adopted different approaches to price carbon. One option is just to introduce a carbon tax at whatever level you want. Another option is to introduce a cap and trade system, like Ontario, Quebec have done, linked in with California. So you see that across the country, we have different levels of carbon prices. We'll have $35 in BC very soon. Starting January 1st, we'll have at least $20 in most other jurisdictions. But notice Ontario and Quebec in the cap and trade system we'll see, because we're not exactly sure what the price will be next year, but it's forecast to be about $19 in 2019. And that is a way for us to compare stringencies of policies across regions of Canada. Last year, or I should say in 2016, the Senate of Canada released a report on internal trade barriers and highlighted the differences in carbon prices, differences in carbon regulations, don't just represent differences in terms of environmental stringency, but also introduce a cost of trading and operating businesses in different regions of the country. And so having these differences across Canada is itself kind of a trade cost that lowers Canada's productivity and doesn't address our climate concerns in the most efficient way possible. So another element of rational carbon policy nationally is to harmonize prices, to make things more uniform across the country, certainly not to have some provinces with lower prices than others. This, I think, will be particularly important in 2019 because starting January 1st, the federal minimum price will be 20. So how the federal government deals with cap-and-trade regions like Ontario and Quebec, does it allow them to have a lower price, as currently seems to be the case, or does it introduce a minimum floor on cap-and-trade prices? So that's going to be something to keep an eye on, and the bigger those price differences are between regions of the country, I think the larger the tension will be. And by 2022, we're not forecasting prices in Ontario and Quebec much more than $22 per ton, yet the minimum federal price will be $50. And so that's leading us further away, I think, from national rational carbon policy. Now, Dennis mentioned as well the issue around pipeline access. We often hear that phrased in terms of whether or not Alberta achieved social license for our energy products. By pricing emissions, we are ensuring that decisions made here incorporate the environmental costs of those decisions. And I think it's a way to illustrate this difference between targeting the price and targeting a quantity. Because it is true that expanding oil and gas production will increase emissions, and if your singular concern was what is Canada's emissions and they ought to fall at any cost, then you might rationally oppose pipeline development or oil and gas extraction activities. But if you recognize the environmental cost is not infinite, then you shouldn't want to incur any cost to lower emissions. You should only want to incur costs that are not much more than the environmental damage from 1 ton of emissions. So having a price on carbon kind of gives that signal. And at $50 a ton, which we are going to by 2020, that is entirely in line with estimates of what the environmental damage from emissions is. And we shouldn't want to engage in activities that lower emissions at a higher cost than that. And blocking pipelines is one of them. But on this issue of social license, I guess I'd be curious to hear what Dennis thinks on that issue, or where he sees the current dispute with BC going.
Well, I think this is an issue that almost every Albertan asks themselves today. Like, what did we get for this carbon tax? Because we know that many of us pay it. It's added to the cost of living in this province, and it hasn't actually delivered anything. And I think it's evident that it has bought us nothing from the environmental movement, that their implacable opposition to hydrocarbon production per se, let alone increases in hydrocarbon production, which is what these pipelines really enable, has been implacable. So there has been no actual quid pro quo that was implicit in that photograph that we saw a few moments ago. And you can see members of Pembina notably in the front row there. And not one of them has stepped forward to say that there is a kind of fairness to be brought forward here for the interests of Alberta because they did apply a carbon tax. So I think we know that the NGO movement is implacable, and there is no social bargain to be struck with them. I think we have to, though, still say the jury is out with the federal government, because they still have to step up and ensure that some of these infrastructure projects are actually realized. And of course, that's going to play out this year, most notably with respect to the Trans Mountain project, where the federal government is going to have to, I think, be arm in arm with Kinder in the courts to ensure that this project is actually realized, and at the same time, clarify its own national policy in a way that I've spoken to previously, that they're going to have to clarify that carbon pricing, constrained by what our trading partners are actually imposing on them, is the real foundation of our carbon position, not, as our current federal environment minister would suggest, is we're going to die on the hill of meeting those targets regardless of what it costs this country. And in fact, that we should have an ambition that exceeds what is already going to imply a compliance cost on the order of $200 a ton when the world shows no capacity even to yet get to our 30. Now, that may change as political leadership in the United States and some other countries change in the next decade, but my guess is that the net of their carbon policy won't be much higher through much of the next decade between the $30 to $50 a ton range that our position is already based on. So I think it is a sobering fact for Alberta that did we get anything for this? is still hanging in the balance as to how 2018 plays out. And I think we will know these answers, as I said before, as to whether Trans Mountain gets to construction. And equally as important, although not as directly tied to Canadian carbon policy, is whether KXL actually also gets to construction, and whether the Shell Consortium, who is deliberating whether they're going to go forward with a massive LNG development at Kitimat, part of their calculus is going to be the stability of carbon policy in Canada when they make their decision as to whether they're going to go forward with that project. And others in this room are probably more keenly aware than I am about just how critical that project going ahead would be for the Alberta gas industry in terms of creating new markets for it, which they so badly need.
Yeah, so before I continue with my last thought, I guess I'll just jump in with one thing Dennis mentioned. It's not just that the federal environment minister or the current federal government is hung up on the target. I mean, that is a target that is shared by both the Liberal and the Conservative governments federally, and by all but one MP voting in favor of it last June. They differ just in terms of what tools they want to deploy to meet that target. You have the Conservatives favoring government-led approaches, regulations, technology subsidies, and you have the Liberal government wanting those and carbon pricing at the same time. So I think both are leading us down a road that's not quite as rational an approach to climate policy as I think Dennis and I are trying to say here, that price should be what we're targeting, not the quantity of emissions itself. The last component, though, of rational carbon pricing that Dennis mentioned in briefing earlier on is, of course, you price carbon, you're going to get some government revenue, and what should you do with that revenue? And different jurisdictions will make different choices, but if our goal is to lower emissions in the most efficient possible way, then the way in which you use revenue matters a lot. So what I've shown here are some estimates on what might $30 per ton mean for Canada's rate of economic growth, depending on how you use the revenue. So on the left, we have the carbon revenue being used to lower corporate income taxes. One over, we have the revenue being used to provide support to industry. This would be either in the form of direct subsidies or exemptions, in particular in trade-exposed sectors where competitiveness is a concern. Next, you have a reduction in personal income taxes, and then finally, household rebates. And I guess not reflected here would just be outright spending of those dollars. You could think of that as having a GDP effect in line with the household rebate bar there. But notice there is a large difference. These show us the effect on annual GDP growth rates. So a reduction of 0.12% off growth rates every year through the magic of compounding, right? That adds up to a significant amount many years down the road. So the difference between minus 0.12 and minus 0.02 is substantial. And the reason why using carbon revenue to reduce income taxes minimizes the economic cost of pricing carbon is because income taxes themselves distort economic activity. Corporate income taxes in particular discourage investment. Personal income taxes discourage employment. So we can use carbon revenue, which is a tax on something we want less of, to reduce the tax on things we want more of, like employment and income. So it's important to keep this part of the puzzle in mind too. So I'd say that, I guess, to summarize in the last few minutes, how I see rational carbon policy in Canada, it is to focus on the price, not the quantity, to ensure that different regions of the country have the same price, to ensure that the price reflects competitiveness issues, of course, as and only ratchet up the stringency as other jurisdictions do, but not to ratchet it up too far, to keep it in line with what we think the actual environmental damage is. And it's not infinite, and it's certainly not the $1,500 to $2,000 per ton cost of blocking a pipeline. And then finally, to use the revenue to reduce other pre-existing policy distortions like income taxation. So I guess those are the four components of rational carbon policy that I would leave us with today.
And I agree with.
Right. So I guess that wraps up kind of our formal thoughts on the topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Trevor and Dennis. I think it was this morning in Haskayne Hour is really critical with the idea that there can be a rational carbon policy. And I also, as we were doing some research for this talk, we realized that there are a lot of confused Canadians out there. And we found a YouTube that, in a sense, reflects the confusion out there.
A tax on carbon means more money taken out of Canadians' pocket. Right. The Prime Minister is trying to sugarcoat the reality by saying carbon pricing, but Canadians are not fooled. That's a new tax. This is bad news for Canadians. They already pay for their share of taxes. Will the Prime Minister guarantee Canadians today that the price of their groceries, gas or heating will not go up because of this new tax?
Mr. Speaker, Canadians need economic growth and good jobs at the same time as we protect the environment. That's exactly what this government is showing the leadership around doing that had been lacking for far too long from the previous government. What we're also guaranteeing is that this tax, this pricing on carbon will be...
Okay, so we were hoping that Justin would show up, but maybe he'll get to watch the YouTube of this. Just before, we're going to move to Q&A, but just before we move to Q&A, I had a question that was triggered by your first graph, Trevor, and I looked at the decline in the emissions, and you said this is, partially caused by the policy. And I guess my question is, are we, in a sense, as a society, moving to reduced emissions? Or do we really see a link between the policy and the reduced emissions? I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but would we have gotten there without the policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that graph initially showed where we thought emissions were going to go in the 2015 forecast from the government, and then what we updated that forecast to be. There's going to be some factors involved in that reduced forecast that have nothing to do with policy. Low oil prices being a particular one that really dramatically reduced the amount of investment in upstream oil and gas, and the projected path of future production growth is substantially lower now.
And low GDP.
And lower GDP, which means all sorts of other activities are suppressed as well. So some of the reduction is just a natural consequence of low oil prices, lowering the rate of oil production and economic activity. But there were two big policy changes, one being the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan, the biggest plank of which was the carbon tax, and the Ontario cap and trade system lowering emissions. Now, by how much a price on carbon lowers emissions is going to differ across jurisdictions. And so it's really tough to say by how much Alberta's emissions will fall due to the carbon tax. We could look to British Columbia. The carbon tax there, estimates vary, but potentially lowered emissions by between 5 to 15%, depending on which study you look at. And this comes from people driving a little less, adopting more fuel-efficient vehicles, more fuel-efficient appliances, and so on, and businesses adopting less emissions-intensive technologies. So pricing will lower emissions, and by how much is tough to say. But I guess one takeaway from what Dennis and I are saying today is that it almost doesn't matter how much emissions fall due to carbon pricing if emitting has benefits associated with the activity that are larger than the environmental damage that the emissions impose, then that is an activity that ought to proceed. Only those activities where the value is less than the environmental damage should we avoid.
Dennis, I have a question for you. So you pointed out how we've missed a key leverage point by not linking our pricing to access. Are there any other leverage points we could still take advantage of?
Well, I think it would be useful, and maybe whether this is a leverage point or not, but I think it would be useful for all of those that are considering investment in energy infrastructure or energy investments, not just in hydrocarbons, but across the board in this country, to have a clarification that our carbon pricing will be constrained by what is imposed by those countries that we trade with, that is a condition on how high our stringency would be. I think if we could have that being clarified by the federal government, it would be enormously beneficial to the investment decisions across the economy, and would both give rise to more efficient applications of capital and energy, But particularly for this province, I think it would be much easier for the folks down the street in the city making investment decisions to know that the carbon price that they have to internalize is actually one that will be constrained by what our trading partners are ultimately imposing on themselves, and not some much more open-ended exposure, which at the moment they would logically have to give real consideration to.
Okay, thank you. Now, we are going to open to Q&A. I will explain the process. What we ask you to do is put up your hand, and somebody will deliver a mic to you, and then I will acknowledge you when it's your time. Okay, right there, I see it's your turn.
I'm Michael Lim. I'm with the School of Public Policy. We're just upstairs, by the way. I have a question for Dennis. Dennis, you mentioned that Alberta's carbon pricing is way too stringent. But the thing is, in Alberta, we have something called output-based allocation, which is basically a rebate system based on carbon emissions. Doesn't that kind of significantly lower the cost than the cost you stated in the slides?
So let me just clarify. The current $30 a ton is more stringent than the benchmark of what California is imposing on themselves. Some could argue that $30 a ton was consistent with what the Obama Clean Power Plan was equivalent to. I think that $30 a ton, and at least until the next U.S. election clarifies where their carbon policy goes, is an acceptable stringency, at least over the short term. And I thank you for making the other acknowledgement, is that the current Alberta policy has embedded a recognition that some of our industries export high energy content material, which is like our bitumen and our natural gas is mostly exported to jurisdictions who don't have the same problem of having carbon tax to internalize, and they do receive what amounts to a rebate. We call the term, they choose to call the term an allocation. Some might call that a subsidy for the fact that they are an export-exposed industry. So yes, I acknowledge that there is an element, and that is an important element of any well-designed carbon policy, is to recognize that energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries should receive a rebate of some kind if they are exporting to jurisdictions that do not have equivalent stringencies on carbon policy. And of course, that would be largely accommodated if you simply equilibrated on the stringency in the first place, so that if we met an emerging American carbon price of somewhere between $20 and $30 a ton, then most of those adjustments wouldn't be necessary in the first place.
Okay. Trevor?
Yeah, I'll just follow up, I guess, with some technical details around this issue. So output-based allocations, the OBAs that Michael mentioned, are a big feature of Alberta's carbon pricing system that has existed for about 10 years now. The names have changed, but when the carbon tax first was brought into Alberta, it applied only to large emitters back in 2008, so 10 years ago. And large emitters that were very emissions intensive were provided essentially with free emissions credits. And those with low emissions were provided with fewer credits. You could imagine a cap and trade system where there are permits and some are given free permits. This is kind of the carbon tax equivalent of that. The change that the new government made was in how those credits are allocated across firms. So now they're done in a way that is the same number per barrel, regardless of what your emissions intensity happens to be. So it's a way of subsidizing a trade-exposed industry to offset the effect of carbon pricing on their production costs, but in a way that doesn't really distort activities across firms within the industry. And it matters a lot. If we were to just price at $30 per ton, the average cost for oil sands in Alberta would rise by between $2 and $3 per barrel, depending on the facility. But the subsidy, the OBA, kind of reduces that to about 50 cents a barrel. So it's big on average in terms of lowering the cost of carbon pricing, and that's because of concerns around competitiveness. The aggregate number of dollars involved is between $3.5 to $4 billion in terms of the amount of effective subsidy being provided to large emitters in Alberta.
Okay. Gordon, I think you have a question.
Yeah, Gordon Sick at the Haskayne School. This question kind of draws on Dennis's export, but reverses it to imports. And it goes back to some of the original pictures we had of Trudeau and the provinces. And in that federal announcement that Trudeau had, he wanted to have all the provinces having some sort of a price on carbon, and that if it was a tax, for example, the tax would stay within the province. Now, this leads to an interesting conundrum that immediately occurred to me, but I've never heard discussed in public policy forums, which could be a very dangerous cost to Alberta. So imagine the following. Alberta is attempting to ship oil, for example, to Ontario and Quebec. And Ontario and Quebec have the opportunity of blocking our oil by blocking our pipelines. So Ontario and Quebec will then go and import oil, and they'll say, my gosh, Saudi Arabia doesn't have a carbon tax. So Ontario and Quebec will say, we apply the carbon tax now because we've received oil that didn't have a carbon tax, and Ontario and Quebec get to hang on to the carbon tax when they import foreign oil. But Alberta hangs on to the carbon tax that it applies on the production of the oil that it exports. So naturally, Ontario and Quebec would prefer to import oil on a tax basis than to take it from Alberta. And the question is, the problem is the federal policy requiring the provinces to have a carbon tax, but saying that the provinces get to hang on to the carbon tax. There has to be a policy that says the federal government exacts that tax for imports and then spreads it across the whole country, not just leaving it in one province.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it raises an issue known as a border carbon adjustment, where you levy a tax on imports in proportion to the embodied emissions that they have. Provinces cannot do that on their own, so it would be the federal government imposing a tariff on an imported product, in this case, oil. And I don't see the federal government going down that road, but if they do, I wouldn't anticipate they would give that to any particular province. That would just be along with the nearly $6 billion in tariff revenue that it already collects and then would be spent in the way that the federal government usually does. But back to the point that if the federal government imposes a carbon tax in a province that doesn't have its own system, the idea is that the revenue would be provided back to the provinces. That's how things are communicated in public. But the legislation proposal itself doesn't require it. It gives the federal government flexibility to return the money to the province, but not necessarily through the government. So it could spend it directly on support for industry or household rebates. And we will see how the federal government actually approaches recycling that revenue when they price carbon in Saskatchewan. It'll be interesting to watch.
Any comment, Dennis, or no? Okay. Then we have another question over here.
If, Bob Braun, if global warming is a concern, and if carbon is a culprit, one of the culprits, and world fairness is the global scenario, why isn't absorption taken into that consideration? Absorption of carbon by, particularly in Alberta with a large agricultural scenario, there's a large absorption scenario, and I would think that both sides of that equation should be considered.
Yeah, and I would say both sides are considered. Absorption is certainly part of the statistics around what Canada's emissions are. They're an important feature of some provinces' approach to climate change and carbon emissions. BC made a big plank, reforestation activities and things of that nature. But even if we're sequestering carbon through sinks and whatnot, that doesn't eliminate the fact that emitting a ton over here has environmental costs associated with it. So even if we're lowering aggregate emissions with sinks, we should only want to do that to the extent that the cost per ton is relatively low. And even doing that activity doesn't change the fact that there might be another way to lower emissions that also has a low cost per ton. So all the options that lower emissions by a ton at a cost less than what we think the environmental damage of a ton is ought to be pursued. Back to the original if questions, I think governments, both left and right, are committed to lowering emissions. They just differ over how. And I think we ought to try and ensure that the way we lower emissions is the least cost way possible.
Trevor, if we could just go to the first slide.
I'm not sure this works anymore.
Oh, doesn't it?
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, just this one. So, Bob, certainly the blue line there, the line that actually demonstrated what had occurred up to 2016, always embeds the contribution of essentially Canadian forests, at least in the way that Environment Canada does that calculation. So that's already embedded in what our net emissions are. I think the point still there is if the rest of the world has a level of carbon emission reduction initiatives that can be explicitly framed as a carbon price, or their policies can be made into the equivalent of a carbon price, it begs the question for Canada that we have to at least be at that level in terms of our commitment, in terms of trying to deal with a risk that, and let's face it, there are some economies and there are some countries that are going to be fundamentally leaders on this, the most notable one being the United States. So, and at the moment, most of that doesn't exist at the federal government level. That may change after 2020, but it does exist across various states, and the most notable of which at the moment is California.
Okay, we have a question right over here.
Sure. Nick Martin with the Canada West Foundation. My question is around the impact of political uncertainty on the efficacy of a carbon tax. So Dennis, you were saying we should put the tax in place and let it do its work. Phasing out coal, like let the carbon tax do that. That's the right way to do it. But if we have a really real chance of the next political party at the provincial level or federal level come in and take away that carbon tax, how does that impact investment decisions that we're trying to have people make? If you have to make a 20-year investment decision on something and that carbon tax might be gone, does that impact it? And if it does, is there a way we can address that?
So my answer is twofold. It would be so useful for this country if there was a national consensus around carbon pricing conditioned by some of the things that Trevor and I have talked to, so that people who are making long-term capital investment, which so typifies the Alberta economy, would be able to rely on relative consensus across our two major political parties on the basic tenets of carbon policy. So it is problematic if we swing to a government that is going to go to zero carbon policy, because quite frankly, that's actually what most right-wing governments and politicians in this country really are advocating. And they can profess to say they want to examine regulations, but as has been pointed out earlier today, most of those regulations and technology initiatives are more costly than a carbon price. So it will be problematic if this country has, for say another 4 years, a carbon policy that is like zero price. And how are you supposed to make decisions in that context? So I acknowledge that that would be problematic, and that's why some of us are committed to try to get in the public discourse a set of principles that should lead to both rational policy and a consensus around it. So I acknowledge that would be a problem.
Yeah, and I guess I would add that political uncertainty lowers investment, absolutely. And it's not just in this file. It's kind of an across-the-board statement that you're not going to make a long-term investment decision if you think that the rules of the game are going to change in the future. I think that's a point in favor of carbon pricing. It's clear, it's transparent, it's predictable, whereas regulations, which is other tools favored more by some than pricing, have more uncertainty around them and potentially higher costs. So
and less transparency.
Less transparency. So if our concern is business investment, and I think it ought to be our concern, that's another point in favor of not a regulatory approach, but a market-based approach like pricing.
Okay, I think we might have one more question over here. Oh, two more. Okay. Jana.
Am I first? Okay. Jana Voiceston, I'm with the Haskayne School of Business. I think I have a question for Trevor. You referred to environmental damage from CO2, even though I don't think CO2 is a pollutant. So I'm curious to know, how do economists calculate the cost, environmental cost of carbon emissions?
Yeah, so this number here, the social cost of carbon, how it's calculated is really a model implied number. So these are what are referred to as integrated assessment models, where they really take as given climate models from not economists, and then we build on top of that models of production activities by country. And then you ask the model, how much would you be willing to pay to lower emissions? And the model itself kind of translates the climate change damages into dollars, but it does take as given climate models from climate scientists. And of course, models differ, so I'm referring only here to the kind of median estimate from Environment Canada, but if you Google social cost of carbon, Environment Canada, they have a long page describing kind of the technical details of these models, and then they show you a very large range of estimates from slightly negative to as high as $200 per ton. So I don't want to hang my hat on 45. There's a lot of uncertainty there because of the underlying modeling exercise.
Dennis?
Well, I would just add to how difficult that number is to actually do, because there are some issues related to health effects and something as morbid as what is the value of human life, which has to be actually priced in order to make these kinds of calculations. So the most interesting observation to make is that the Obama administration was very committed to this calculation, and their mid-range number was very close to this $45, which I found interesting. So I think it does indicate that if you do this exercise with some level of intellectual integrity, you get to numbers that are probably less than $100 a ton.
Yeah, Canada's actually piggybacking heavily on the work of the EPA, so our numbers are never going to differ too much from theirs. I guess I'll end by saying whatever the number is, conceptually, there exists a number. And we might want to get a sense of what the order of magnitude is of environmental damage. And this helps us distinguish between options. Whether blocking pipelines or not is an appropriate choice to lower emissions depends on how big you think those environmental costs are. And it's very hard to get estimates that are as high as the economic costs involved in blocking pipelines. So to know it's 45, maybe less, maybe more, it's not 2 orders of magnitude more.
Okay, one last question over here.
Hi, so Junaid from PepsiCo. So my question, interestingly, was exactly what the social cost of carbon means. And I guess you just spoke about that a little bit, so thank you.
Another way to think about how to value the environmental damage would be to not look at a model and ask it to tell you what the price the agents in the model are willing to pay to avoid emissions, but to ask what's a price that, if applied globally, would be consistent with some particular temperature goal you might have in mind. So the IPCC does this in its reports. It lays out what path of global price would be consistent with various degrees of temperature targets. And $50 between now and 2030 is completely consistent with a 2-degree target, and then would have to rise after that. So roughly speaking, if Canada increased beyond 2022, the $50, if it grew at about $5 a year per ton plus inflation, that would be consistent with a 2-degree global temperature target.
Lauren, if I could just add one last comment to the group. And it would be useful to take a look at some of the most recent forecasts, which most notably have been offered for free by ExxonMobil and BP. And you can discount them because they are ExxonMobil and BP, but they're quite consistent with the kinds of forecasts that are generated by the IEA, the International Energy Administration. The point is that the demand for hydrocarbons is enormously enduring and robust. So world demand, global demand for crude oil, including Alberta bitumen, is actually quite, it's not declining, it is at worst stable. Natural gas is expected to grow. So one of the other parts of this entire dialogue about rational carbon policy is it unfolds in a world that still has an enduring demand for hydrocarbons. And that notwithstanding the rise of renewables to some degree in the electric generation sector, the aggregate demand for hydrocarbons, the hydrocarbons that Alberta can produce, is not actually declining globally. And that is another part of this conversation that, that I do hope you send this video to the Federal Environment Minister and the Minister of Enercan, because I think it would be instructive to them to really ponder some adjustments and recognitions of that reality.